long. My name's Bim Afolami, MP for Hitchin and Harpenden, Chair of PRASEG. It's a pleasure to join you today. Soon we'll be back in person. Yeah, soon we will get there. And today we are working with the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit on this event. And before I introduce our panelists, I'd just like to frame sort of the point at which we are. We all know we're coming up to COP26, but critically, we are at a time when there have been lots of international commitments made. I should add, this is part of a series of events PRASEG is holding. We've had one on the UK on the updated NDCs. This is the second. There are going to be further events on the US, China, vulnerable countries, third world countries as well. So please stick with us and please continue to join the events. So, we're in this moment. Last week, I think in the last week, or at least in the last couple of weeks, there have been the following emissions pledges. From the British government, we have the 6th carbon budget adoption, which is a cut of 78% of emissions by 2035, or at least that is the ambition. The United States has committed to cutting carbon emissions by half, I think by 2030. The European Union has passed its new European climate law as well. So there is just a huge amount going on, and we have brought 3 fantastic, eloquent, interesting, and well-informed people to talk to us about it and what's going on. So first of all, we have Jacob Werksmann, who is the Principal Climate Advisor to the European Commission, so an absolutely pivotal person at the moment with the European climate law and everything in that regard. We have Lara Lazaro-Touza, who is the Senior Analyst at the Cairo Royal Institute, and also a university lecturer and all-round knowledgeable person who lectures all over the world, from what I can gather, to reflect on COP25 in Spain and what she sees as the differences and the comparisons between COP25 and COP26 as we come up to it in November. And then we have Pete Betts, the UK's foremost guru on climate change. He should probably be called a czar. Yeah, Pete Betts, the czar on climate change, who was the lead negotiator of the EU in the past on COP. His name always comes up on this stuff whenever he talks to anybody in the British government. And so from a British and EU perspective as well, Pete will be able to give us a lot of insights. So that's the cast list. I'm going to hand over to them in turn to give their initial thoughts on where we are, relationship between the EU, the UK, the US, and other big players in the world, and indeed internationally, how we are getting to a more positive place. Jacob, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Bim, and good morning, colleagues. Great to be able to join you. Yes, as Bim said, my name is Jake Werksmann. I work at the European Commission for the Directorate for Climate Action, which is that part of the Commission that's responsible both for the design of EU domestic climate policy, but also for our international engagement on climate policy as well. I am one of the EU lead negotiators. And so before Pete became a czar, that indeed was one of his titles, was EU lead negotiator. And so we helped to take forward the policies that the European Union sets for itself into the international sphere. So I wanted to start out with just some remarks about how aligned I think the EU and the UK are in the run up to COP26 and to Glasgow, and in what ways we're aligned. I think it's important to keep in mind that in the timescale of the international climate negotiations, which have now been at it for 30 years in trying to design an international regime that would respond to what the science is telling us that we have to do, with the Paris Agreement being the latest version of that. Over that past 30 years, that's a very long timescale. And it's only recently, within that timescale, that the UK and the EU have gone their separate ways. So it's not surprising that a lot of the objectives and aspirations that the EU and the UK have for COP26 are shared aspirations and expectations, because the track record of European leadership we very much built together over the time in which the UK was still a member state. And I think we continue that continues to put us in a very good stead in terms of both leading, but also having very concrete and specific expectations of what a successful COP looks like. I think our ongoing cooperation has been made easier by the fact that the EU-UK trade and cooperation agreement that we spent much of last year negotiating really did focus on the need for us to maintain our standards, but also our relationships in these areas. So the fact that we parted ways with climate and energy policy that had been developed together, and our cooperation agreement binds us both to maintain high standards in this area, is also helpful in the ongoing conversations that we've had with the UK. I think the other thing that's helped is that, of course, the UK has stepped into a unique role over the past 2 years, and will be in that role for another year, which is as COP presidency, first incoming for 2 years, and then, of course, the outgoing COP presidency after Glasgow takes place. And that enabled us to sort of set behind any negative aspects of the breakup and really focus on this aspect of the new relationship as well, where the UK is expected to exert leadership, not just as a party to Paris, but as the party that has been appointed to lead the international community in the preparation for Glasgow. Having said that, moving from that common foundation, I think that we, not surprisingly, lead in very similar ways. And the first way that I think both the EU and the UK are leading during this period is through our ambitious domestic policy. From the EU, you will have seen with the formation of this new commission, a commitment to the European Green Deal. And I think this would be an aspect of the way in which the Commission and the EU is working that would be less familiar to the UK. It really has had a very profound effect in placing climate change ambition, both with regard to cutting emissions, but also in terms of ensuring that the EU is a more climate resilient continent as well. It has placed that at the center of just about everything that the Commission proposes and does. And it seems that we're bringing the EU governments largely with us at the same time. That's a really different change from previous commissions. I mean, even as I was saying, the EU has, I think, been at the forefront in terms of setting ambitious targets and complying with them. It's just a different world now. Every aspect of the Commission's work, every DG, whether it's DG Trade, it's parts of the DG that are working on the budget, on finance, they're all having to work towards the European Green Deal's commitment to a low carbon transition. So that is what has led to those ambitious targets that Bim, you referred to from the European side. And I think we've been impressed as well by the announcements that have been made by the UK post-Brexit in terms of setting its new nationally determined contribution under Paris, and then most recently this interim 2035 target as well. So leading by example is absolutely key, and I think both the UK and the EU are doing that through our domestic policies. The second, of course, is the support for multilateralism. The EU has been, I think, the most loyal observer of every rule that we've set for ourselves through the Framework Convention, through to the Kyoto Protocol. It's had a profound effect on the design of our own domestic policies. It was through the Kyoto Protocol that the EU took the steps down the road towards a cap and trade system, which has now become the European trading system, and which the UK now also has as part of its policies, cap and trade as a way of achieving our targets. But more generally, just building and following and investing in the improvement of the quality of the multilateral rules that help us to set targets, but also importantly, help us to hold ourselves and our partners accountable for the targets that we set. That also, I think, defines European leadership and UK leadership as well on the road to Glasgow. And then finally, and I think very importantly as well in the current geopolitics, is our leadership through the support that we provide to our partners, recognizing that many of them are developing countries that need technical, financial, and other kinds of assistance in order for them to also set ambitious climate policies and to follow through on them. The EU, when we were the 28, held itself out as the world's most generous provider of development assistance and climate finance. And I think we continue to be that. And the UK is a generous provider as well. So that kind of support, but also the kind of diplomacy that we're seeing now, which is about encouraging partners, including those that don't need our support, to do more, is an essential part of leadership as well. On the road to Glasgow, just to get a little bit into some of the more details of what's happening now, I think you can see that there are sort of basically two tracks to the process of what we're trying to achieve. One, I think, can be generally referred to as the diplomacy of ambition. So what you saw at the Biden summit, the work that the UK COP presidency is doing on a bilateral basis, what the EU is doing in our series of summits. We have one with India coming up. We have one with the US. We will have one with China as well. At the top of our diplomatic agenda is to encourage countries that, particularly those that haven't already done so, to come forward with revised Paris targets, to come forward with commitments to be net zero in terms of their emissions by a date certain in the middle of this century, and to come forward with plans and pathways as to how they intend to get there. That diplomatic effort is something that has been going on over the past 2 years and will reach its culmination in Glasgow. It's not just about cutting ambitions, and I think the UK COP presidency and the EU have been sending similar signals about this. It's also about coming forward with more climate finance and also showing that we are increasing the strength of our domestic policies around adaptation as well. The EU the Commission just published an adaptation strategy for the EU. It's going through the process of being debated amongst member state governments, but that was a very important policy document that we added to our commitments to cut emissions to show that we're serious about taking action in the area of adaptation as well. The second main effort, in addition to that diplomacy of ambition that we're going through at the moment, is, of course, continuing to build the international regime. We still have leftover work that we have to achieve in terms of completing the design of the transparency framework under the Paris Agreement. This really gets into some of the weeds, but very important weeds, because this is the set of rules that we all need to comply with to show that we're not just setting targets for ourselves, but we're actually implementing them. And this set of reporting rules that include opportunities for expert review of the information that we submit, as well as the peer review of parties' performance are key to that transparency and accountability that the multilateral rule set provides for. And we haven't finished that rule book, and there's a lot of effort that needs to be made between now and Glasgow to do that. But there's also an aspect of the negotiations which is setting the stage for the next era of the development of the regime, and in particular, the completion of the design of what we refer to as the Paris Agreement ambition cycle, or the global stocktake. In order for Paris to work effectively, we have to constantly come back, review, and update the targets that parties have come forward with. And Paris provides that we do that on a 5-year cycle, but we haven't yet begun that first cycle. And we've got to do a lot more work in the international negotiations to make sure that cycle is as effective as possible in pulling together the latest science, assessing the progress that we've made so far, and giving parties guidance as to how much further we have to push in the next round of commitments that we have to undertake. So all of that, of course, is now taking place in a virtual context because of COVID. Just like every other aspect of our lives, we can't meet in person for the most part. I think for multilateralism, this is particularly challenging when you're dealing with over 190 countries, plus all of international civil society that wants to get together in the way that we did in Madrid at COP25. And obviously the health precautions that are being taken around the world don't make that possible yet. And this is challenging, I think, both for the diplomacy of ambition as well as the technical negotiations, probably much more difficult in terms of the virtual negotiations, where we're seeing that still many of our partners are nervous about moving forward with anything that looks like formal textual discussions in a virtual format. So it's another challenge that both the EU and the UK COP presidency faces, is trying to provide a format that gives all of our partners enough comfort that they won't be disenfranchised or disempowered in a context where they have to rely upon internet connections and virtual engagement to get their viewpoints across. So let me stop there, and looking forward to hearing from Lara and from Pete and to engaging in the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Jacob. Lara, Jacob mentioned COP25. You want to talk about that amongst talking about other things as well? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Bim. It's a pleasure for me to be here and an honor. COP25 and COP26 are similar in a very asymmetric way. They're both COPs that are like no other. As you know, COP25 was supposed to be hosted, in addition to being presided by Chile, a month before the COP was going to be hosted in Santiago. The COP moved to Madrid. So as one of my friends from the climate sphere said to me, you know, out of the 12 countries that could potentially have pulled this off in a month, we're the only crazy ones. And I think COP26 is again quite complex because of the resilience. You know, being COP president for so long is, I think, a stretch for everyone. I guess that the key significance of COP25 was basically, while being a COP amongst big COPs, maintaining political momentum. And I think thinking about what would have happened if Madrid hadn't occurred is interesting here. We would have had no COP25 and then the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, and turning everything virtual. So even though the results from COP25 were lukewarm, and we didn't manage to close the implementation rulebook, and Article 6 of the Paris Agreement regarding market and non-market mechanism is still very much open, or perhaps more open than we would have liked. I think maintaining that momentum has to be underlined as one of the key takeaways of COP25. It also shows how the Spanish government supports, as do all of the other members of the European Union, international negotiations and multilateralism. What Spain tried to do as host of the COP, but maintaining the Chilean presidency, was basically mimic what was already planned for Chile. So we maintained both the blue zone, the formal negotiating zone, and also the green zone, where non-party stakeholders gathered. It was a very populous COP, over 27,000 people in the blue zone, over 30,000 people in the green zone. The Spanish government also had another initiative in which we met with Pete, amongst other colleagues, called Castellana Verde, which entailed events of all sorts with the COP25 stamp. So I think this sort of sets the scene. We organized the COP around 9 themes. So it's slightly broader, slightly more perhaps Christmas tree, if you like, compared to the 5 campaigns of the UK. We do share things such as nature-based solutions, adaptation and resilience between the 2 COPs. I think that as for the results, the idea of inclusion and recognition by non-party stakeholders. We had the Chile-Madrid Time for Action. And I think that the idea of science informing policy making, which has been key throughout the 30 plus years of negotiations, helped not only COP25, or was not only one of the results of COP25, but also has helped in national legislation. We are about to adopt our climate change and energy transition law, and we have, building on the Committee on Climate Change that the UK has since 2008, we are going to have one of those. So a policy diffusion of the results is also important. The social impact is also something that has to be underlined. The surveys that we had after COP25 show that while people have not become more or less skeptics about climate change, Spanish citizens do recognize that they are more positive about the solution towards climate change. They're more aware about climate change, and there has been significant social and media interest. We had 1,100 volunteers and 1,500 media outlets registered for COP25. So it's an incredible amount of attention for a country like Spain. This also has a bearing on how we perceive our foreign policy priorities. At Elcano Royal Institute, we conduct analyses on what the key priorities in terms of foreign policy should be. Since 2017, climate change is a top foreign policy priority, and this continues to be the case in 2020 after hosting COP25. In terms of budgeting, I don't know whether any of you might be interested in the more sort of practical details of the COP, but we budgeted 86 million euros for hosting the COP. We ended up spending 50.5 million euros. We had 10 million in sponsorships and other donations. And the revenue from people staying in Madrid amounted to 20 million euros, with some money coming from, or hopefully coming from, the EU to fund part of the COP. So those are some of the figures that might be of interest to you. As regards expectations for COP26, and here I might be repeating some of the things that Mr. Werksmann just told us, but I think Paris compatible NDCs is in everyone's mind, so that diplomacy of ambition. Also wrapping up the guidelines, as we said, and Article 6. The alignment of financial flows with climate goals, the Article 2.1c of the Paris Agreement, I think has been mentioned in terms of international climate finance. The international climate finance gap, according to the OECD in 2018, out of the 100 million US dollars that was pledged first in Cancun and then enshrined in Copenhagen and then enshrined in the Cancun agreements and then referred to in the Paris Agreement as well. There's a gap of 21.1 billion in 2018. So that means we still have a bit to go. Most of the funding has gone to climate mitigation, so we still have an extra effort, the extra mile there in terms of financing climate adaptation. In terms of private international finance, the idea is again aligning climate goals with financial flows, and there we have to step up our efforts from the billions to the trillions. The analysis by Climate Policy Institute tells us that that gap is very significant, and if we are to align the global stock of financial capital of 386 trillion in 2018, we have a massive task ahead. One of the issues that I think COPs can reflect is what's happening in the current context of the COP. Madrid tried to give voice to the youth and indigenous peoples. The youth, as we can recall, in 2019, were out in the streets demanding further action in line with climate science. As regards climate financing this year, I think the alignment of recovery plans and fiscal stimulus packages to the goals of the Paris Agreement is something that is in everyone's minds. Up to now, and compared to the stimulus packages that we had in the aftermath of the global financial crisis of 2008, we are faring a bit worse. Edward Barbier published a paper in 2010 telling us about how 15% of the global stimulus packages, which at the time was 3 trillion, amounted to 3 trillion, 15% was allocated to green recovery. Now, the size of recovery packages at the moment, as per the latest analysis published by Vivid Economics in February 2021, states that the money pledged for recovery amounts to 14.9 trillion, out of which 1.8 trillion can be considered green. So that is 12%, 12.08%. So with everything that we know, it seems as though we are not allocating great percentages. Obviously, this we have to make an exception for the EU here. We know that both the multi-annual financial framework and the Next Generation EU allocate 30% of the funds to climate action. And this goes up to 37% in the recovery and resilience mechanism. But I think that there are proposals out there by both UK academics and European academics for further stepping up the efforts at COP26 in terms of promoting an intergovernmental sustainable recovery alliance or climate alliance by Professor Ekins, Dimitris Engelis, Cameron Hepburn. This is also echoed by other EU scholars that are calling for COP26 to really give this agenda a push and perhaps have the high-level ministerial meetings include these as one of the key themes. And I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Lara, thank you very much. Thank you for that. And finally, before questions, we have Pete Betts to give us his take on things. Pete.
Thanks, Bim. Because I don't work for a government anymore, I'll try to be a bit controversial. I agree with almost everything that's been said, but I'll try and bring out a few points. So I want to say something about sort of historic EU-UK cooperation. We were in the EU. Secondly, very quickly, you know, what are the objectives for Glasgow? And then thirdly, some possible challenges and risks around the theme of today, which I would like to talk about. I mean, maybe just an introductory remark. I'm very pleased and honoured to be doing this. I do worry a little bit that the UK domestic debate is very focused on domestic delivery. And of course, that's really important. We have to deliver, we have to walk the walk. But, you know, so many of civil society just constantly come back to, you know, in a debate about COP26, about what is the UK going to do? UK has to walk the walk, but it also has to convene the global conversation. That's its job as the COP president. So just a little bit about EU-UK. I mean, we were in the EU for most of the time we're talking about. The EU has consistently been the leader in international climate, and, you know, setting ambitious pledges and delivering them. Those policies have driven down the costs of technologies globally, which permits a different development path for developing countries. We've now got cheaper renewable energy than fossil fuels in many parts of the world, for example. I think the UK the EU with the UK also provided the lion's share of official development assistance, of climate finance as well over this period. And I know that when I represented the EU, I often got frustrated, as I know others in the EU do, that the EU didn't always get the credit for that. And frankly, the soft power benefits. So I think it's important that we are absolutely clear about that, the massive contribution the EU has made and continues to make, and committing to that multilateral regime, even as, you know, our friends in the US withdrew twice from that international process. So that's the first remark. I mean, second remark, very briefly, because I think Jake is absolutely right that there are very closely aligned interests and objectives between the EU and the UK for the COP. Very sort of crudely, 4 broad objectives. 1, get more ambition. And we've got very ambitious targets from the UK and the EU. And we've just seen some more from some of the other big developed economies. We don't yet have some of the other big economies, and in particular, China. This is not to demonize China. They're just bigger than the US, the EU, and Japan put together. And what they do matters far more than what we do. So, you know, we still need to hear something ambitious from China. We haven't heard from India yet, and we all understand tragic circumstances mean they've got other things on their minds at the moment. Indonesia, Brazil's actually slightly weakened their base year. So, you know, actually the developed country targets, you know, US, Japan, Canada, not to mention the EU, look much better than I would have dreamed possible 6 months ago. You could say they're not enough given our massive, you know, the massive gap we have to what we need to do, but they are significant steps forward, and we need others too. Second objective is finance. So as Lara said, we have to deliver on the 100 billion. We're not on track for that. And we have to raise the proportion that goes on adaptation. We have to address concerns around loss and damage. But I think what Lara said about this broader finance piece is really important. Green recovery, most stimulus packages have not been green around the world. There's this whole debt issue. The developing countries, many of them are in deep trouble following COVID and the economic fallout of COVID. If we could get some kind of ways of addressing the debt problems, again, China is by far the biggest bilateral creditor, so they would need to be part of that. We do have now, I think it's now almost in the bag. We will get a significant addition of special drawing rights through the IMF, $650 billion. That is a big opportunity, particularly if some of those special drawing rights could be reallocated to the poorer countries. Third thing, negotiate agenda, as Jake said, it's relatively modest compared to Paris. It's not where we had a treaty to negotiate, but there's still some important points that we have to close off, like carbon markets, like aspects of transparency, like the adaptation goal, like finance goals and so on. And then fourthly, the sort of all these real economy collaborations, real finance collaborations, getting commitments from big companies, international institutions to mainstream climate risk in their decision making, getting countries and companies to commit to phasing out coal or internal combustion engines, so on. I think those are the 4 big themes, and I don't think you would get a cigarette paper between the UK and the EU on most of those priorities. Finally, thirdly, just slightly presumptuously, some challenges. Although I do think the EU and the UK are very well aligned. I know, for example, the president designate has a very good relationship with the vice president of the EU, Mr. Timmermans. But I do worry a little bit that because UK ministers no longer sort of troop along to Brussels every other week, you know, for meetings, they don't naturally form those relationships that they would have formed in the past. Neither do senior officials, and I do think that's something we need to think about. I hope Jake won't be angry with me for saying this. I do occasionally, much as I think the EU has been by far the biggest force for good in the climate negotiations and the climate process, I do think sometimes the EU can be a bit inward looking, as can we. And the EU's got a very big legislative agenda to drive through now. And I do worry that might divert them a little bit from sort of diplomatic work. And it has often been a challenge for us in the EU to really coordinate the diplomatic resources that the EU has at its disposal, because so much of it is in the member states, and try and make that, you know, work collectively is hard. I think there's definitely a sort of sense of, you know, oh great, we all love the Biden-Harris administration, we all want to work with them, and I think there's probably a bit of a nervousness in the EU that they'll get all the credit for all the work that the EU has patiently done over the years, and I think we should be sensitive to that. I think there are kind of emerging sotto voce differences between how the EU and the US might play China. And I think US is keen to draw the EU into a common front with China. And of course, they do have similar objectives from China. I think the EU also has in the back of its mind the fact that carbon border adjustment mechanisms are just over the horizon, and they're keen to draw China into a conversation about that so that it doesn't become a source of, real friction and tension. So I think there are some nuances in the way that the bilateral relationships will work, both between the UK and the EU, but also the EU and the US, which I think might be interesting. So very quick remarks, and Bim, I look forward to questions and discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Pete. I just got two questions that I'll ask the panel, and I'll direct them to particular members of the panel, and then if any of the other two want to quickly comment, they can, and then we'll move into the audience. If any members of the audience have any questions, do put them in chat. Because otherwise you'll have me thinking up all my hobby horses, and you don't necessarily want that or need that in your life. I want to take you up, Pete, but this is actually a question for Jacob, but on something Pete just said about finance and the fact that we've made progress, but we're not quite there on the finance solutions that are needed. My question simply is, bearing in mind the internal EU difficulty with fiscal transfers from north to south, for example, how realistic do we think it is that the EU can make transfers from itself, the developed world, to the developing world, bearing in mind the financial difficulties, the outflow of capital that they've had as a result of COVID?
Thanks for the question, Bim. I mean, financial transfers in the sense of providing development assistance, development cooperation, as I said in my opening remarks, I think both the EU and the UK have a track record of being very generous in that area. I don't think it's going to be, looking at the EU budget, I don't think it's going to be significantly affected by COVID. I understand there have been some challenges in maintaining the traditional commitment within the UK, but at least looking at the EU budget, it doesn't seem like that will be reduced in any significance. But I think that's one of the main chunks of money that is measured in the context of trying to reach that $100 billion annual goal that Lara referred to, and that has such a significant and probably disproportionate political importance in the context of climate change politics, because it's what many of our developing country negotiators look at as to whether or not we're following through on our commitments, whether we've performed in a trustworthy way, as I think unfortunately some of the leadership within the UN system refers to it. But that's a very important chunk of money for those reasons, but it's nowhere near as important as what we refer to by shorthand as the 2.1C challenge, or the trillions challenge, which both Lara and Pete referred to, which is really trying to think about ways in which public finance and public policy can more effectively channel private sector investments, north-south, south-south, north-north. And that's the much bigger, more difficult thing to get around. What the EU is doing in that space is coming forward with more guidance on how it is that investors can make distinctions between green and not green finance through something called the finance taxonomy that we've been developing within the Commission, and we published a first version of just a few days ago. That is supposed to help move those bigger financial flows in the right direction, because what we are seeing is that more and more investors, whether they are individuals, household level, or big institutional investors like pension funds and sovereign wealth funds, are interested in making sure that their investments are greener, lower carbon, and therefore more sustainable. And they need the guidance in order to help them to do so. So we're hoping that that taxonomy is going to be an inspiration to others. It's going to be an important part of our conversation with the US. which wants to do similar things. They tell us, though they're a bit skeptical as to whether or not our taxonomy is the right way to go. That, you know, we're aligned in terms of principle. And obviously, it's an important part of our cooperation with the UK, which continues to be such a significant player in managing international financial markets as well.
Great, thank you. And one for Pete before I move on to the questions that are coming in. What is your sense, Pete, of the extent to which the EU and frankly the UK's ambitious targets on carbon emissions are dependent on effectively outsourcing fossil fuel emissions to other parts of the world which do not have the same targets? And in the EU's context, importation of natural gas and various other things from Russia, and perhaps even within the EU, the dynamic around eastern parts of Eastern Europe where there's a heavy reliance on coal. So I'm just interested in your sense of that, Pete.
Yeah, this is an old chestnut. I mean, I think that first of all, I think in the medium term, we are going to have to find a solution to so-called embedded emissions. You know, I think it's probably unrealistic to change international regimes so that countries own emissions produced in another country. I think, you know, the country who would hate that most is probably China, because it would give us sort of legitimacy to interfere in their domestic arrangements. But I do think that, you know, I think that the challenges that we are going to face in the UK and in the EU over the next 10 years are of a very different order to the ones we faced in the past. You know, we are going to have to do some really difficult, challenging things. You know, 27 million boilers in homes is going to be a much more noticeable thing than decarbonising power. And I think the EU will face similar types of challenges. I guess the EU is starting to address this question of embedded emissions through this notion of carbon border adjustment mechanisms, which, you know, is supposed to put everyone on the same level playing field. I mean, intellectually, I think that's the right way to go, but as the EU knows very well, it's extremely sensitive. I mean, the EU brought international aviation into the emissions trading scheme about 10 years ago, and China, India, US, Russia went crazy. The Chinese said they wouldn't buy Airbus, and you couldn't see us for dust. I mean, we were, you know, and you know, and that was a sign of how much, you know, importance I suppose we attached to that issue at the time. So this will have to be done very sensitively, and the EU knows that very well, and I think is doing so. Although, you know, a complicating factor now is that it will be a source of revenue. So it's setting up a sort of tension in the EU system where some people really, really want this to happen.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah,
there?
Lara, please.
Yes, just in response to Pete's comment on the US getting the credit, I think, you know, the double default that the US has committed, you know, first adopting but then not ratifying the Kyoto Protocol, and then adopting and ratifying and being one of the key architects of the Paris Agreement, but then withdrawing, you know, through Article 28 of the Paris Agreement, has made a dent in how people think about the US as a, you know, long-term reliable partner. I think it was Jason that was saying, you know, the EU has been the staunch defender of climate action. You know, we are like a mini lab for the world. We're so asymmetric. We have different interests, but we've been there all the way through. When the US pulled out of or didn't ratify the Kyoto Protocol, it was the EU and negotiating with Russia there, you know, through the linked strategy of supporting their access to the WTO, that then made in that November of 2004 Russia to ratify and us to go through that threshold. We didn't want to use the ETS, and thanks to the UK, you know, amongst other things, we developed all of this. So I don't think that we are going to really forget about all of that. I mean, perhaps people outside the climate community might, I think negotiators, while we're very happy to have them on board, and it would make things much, much more difficult if we had had a second term of Donald Trump, I would be perhaps a bit less cautious about the credit going to the US. On China, we haven't spoken about greening the BRI, and we do have the peaking ahead of 2030 and the peaking and the carbon neutrality ahead of 2060. But if we don't green the BRI, I know it's something that Xi Jinping says, and we have the International Coalition for Greening the BRI. But if you look at the numbers, most of the investments along the BRI in energy and infrastructure from 2014 to 2018, over 3/4 have gone to fossil fuels. And this is simply incompatible, or potentially incompatible, with reaching the Paris Agreement goals. So I think China has also spoken about the coal phase down in the 15th five-year plan. But until coal phase down and not phase out, or at least that's what the translator said when Xi Jinping was talking. I'm just wondering whether, that phase down and phase out is something that we should be looking into, because obviously the language with Chinese negotiators, as we all know, is quite sometimes less straightforward to decipher. The Ministry of Ecology and Environment warned in 2019 of the potential problems that a carbon border adjustment mechanism could imply for international climate cooperation in their November report. So I think it's also very, very important to think about those things, as Pete said. Thanks.
Thank you. Questions from the floor. Caroline Lucas has a couple of questions. Caroline.
Thank you. Sorry, Barry was before me.
Forgive me. Right. Well, you're on, Caroline. Why don't you go, sorry, and then Barry, you go next. And sorry, Barry,
at least you knew, Barry, that I was trying to be good. Thank you so much for that. Really fascinating. Pete mentioned loss and damage just recently, and I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the EU's position on loss and damage, and how much of a priority that's going to be in the negotiating strategy from the EU, because I'm just getting quite worried that the climate vulnerable countries obviously, are going to come into COP26 probably feeling pretty angry about vaccines and probably feeling pretty angry about the 100 billion. And we know just what a kind of a totem this loss and damage is. It really matters. It's got a symbolic weight as well as a real weight as well. So one question was about that. And the second one, because I think Bim touched on it, but I'm not sure it was fully answered, was just a little bit more about how much the ambition in Brussels is affected by the reliance of Eastern Europe, in particular Poland, on coal, and what's going on right now to try to transition those fossil fuel heavy economies within the EU, and whether or not that is acting as a weight against the EU being even more ambitious than it is being.
Anybody wants to take that? Right, Jacob, over to you.
Yeah, I think both questions were kind of directed a little bit at how the EU is approaching certain issues. So I'm happy to respond. I also have to kind of give a warning that I'm going to have to hop off. I have to go back to a working party. Pete will be familiar, I'm sure, fondly familiar with those on the hour. So, I mean, just briefly on loss and damage, I absolutely agree that the politics insists that we have to treat this issue much more seriously than we have in the past, and the EU is pivoting to do that, and we're doing it by making clear that when we talk about loss and damage, we are not talking about it in the way in which it was initially conceived and advocated by some countries, which was a responsibility on developed countries to fund those poorer countries that were suffering the impacts of climate change on the basis of legal liability and an obligation to compensate on the basis of legal liability. Once we shift away from that and turn more to the need as global citizens to provide humanitarian support then the politics shift as well, and our ability to be more helpful, I think, is much more opened up. It still raises the challenge of how, even when we have the will, how can we provide support at the scale that may be needed, and through what means? I'm quite skeptical, having been working on the UNFCCC institutions for more than 30 years, that process has the capacity to be of direct and genuine benefit to communities that are suffering. But there are many other bilateral international organizations that can help, and I think the real challenge is how do we mobilize them? The humanitarian relief organizations, the information systems that provide early warning systems, the organizations that help to provide support through insurance. All of these things are there and available and need to be scaled up. With regard to the internal European political challenges of working with communities that are currently dependent upon fossil fuels, whether it's coal or frankly it's automobile manufacturing and the internal combustion engine, that is squarely within the European Green Deal strategy. And we refer to it as the need to ensure a just transition. And we're addressing that through some very traditional means, which is by looking at the way in which we share the effort to reduce and cut emissions across the EU, and making sure that the countries that are more dependent on fossil fuels within the Union have more time to transition, but also through the collection and distribution of financial resources as well, through for example, the Just Transition Fund that we've set up under the European Green Deal that will provide support directly to communities that could be at risk as part of that transition. And really focusing on things like reskilling and helping to ensure that those communities are in a position to benefit from the transition as well as to survive the transition through temporary job losses, et cetera. Thanks.
Great. I'm very mindful. I missed out Barry. So Barry, you're next.
Bim, thanks. And if I could first to Jacob, after thanking Caroline for her gracious allowance, in fact, I was going to ask the same on loss and damage, but first to Jacob, you rather skated over, I felt, the need to complete the rule book and Article 6. And this is a problem for the EU as much as it is a problem, internally, as much as it is a problem externally. And I wondered if you could, before you go, and I appreciate it, certainly, you want to leave on the hour, if you could elaborate on how the EU would like to see the rule book completed and Article 6 resolved.
I can only do that in general terms because it does get very, very technically detailed. But both the EU and the UK want to see the Article 6 rules completed in such a way that they ensure as much as possible environmental integrity in the way in which international carbon markets work, and do that through stronger accounting rules that in particular prevent double counting. So ensuring that no two countries, or frankly, no two actors, including companies, use the same emissions reductions to claim to be achieving their targets. So that requires ensuring that we have the rest of the international community behind us. I think in large part we do. All of the progressive developing countries that are worried that carbon markets could be used as an excuse for escaping responsibilities rather than achieving it are behind us in trying to secure these accounting rules that will prevent double counting, and ensuring that the new mechanism that will replace the CDM is generating and certifying offsets that are genuinely additional to what might otherwise have occurred. And that means improving, frankly, the methodologies that the CDM has been using over the past 15 years or so.
Jacob, if
you're looking like you want more detail.
Well,
you're hungry for more.
What you've said so far is we want everybody to be transparent, truthful, and honest, and play the game with a straight bat, if I can use an English cricketing metaphor. And of course we do. The difficulty is that there is diplomacy around that. So what I'm really asking, I suppose, is what are the diplomatic levers that the EU believes it can utilize in order to achieve that consensus? Because if asked, everybody will say, well, of course, we want it to be, not additional. Of course, we want everybody to be, straightforwardly and honestly accounting for what they do. But it's not as easy as that.
Yeah. Well, I'll give you one example of a diplomatic lever, which is as a participant in international carbon markets. I mean, our commitment is largely domestic, but we are linking domestically with other emissions trading systems, but also through things like the standards that we might set for corporate claims around climate neutrality, that we as the EU, as a major player in international carbon markets, signal that we think that units that have not followed these rules have no value, have no environmental value, and therefore should have no market value. And working with other market players, both on the potential investor side as in the potential host side, to form a coalition that basically says the same thing. And this is why we're so interested in the work that the UK COP presidency has been doing with Mark Carney and others to explore the potential role of voluntary carbon markets, and want to see more of an effort for that initiative to align with the Paris Agreement rules, to acknowledge that corporate claims that might be based on units that could be double counted should not be recognized as being legitimate, whether you're a private actor or you're a public actor. So that's just one way of trying to use the market forces to basically say, buyer beware, or buyer don't buy, even better, units that can't be demonstrated to follow these rules.
Thank you. That's very helpful. The other before you go question, I suppose, is it's picking up on what Lara was talking about in terms of China and the commitments that we've had from China. But it's how does the EU see its ability to leverage with China? How is it working with China on the Kunming COP on biodiversity to ensure that it has traction around these issues and integrating the two COPs together? And how is it seeking to use its influence with China in terms of what we talked about in terms of the greening of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Yeah, well, more than I can respond to with justice in a few remaining seconds. But I would say that I think where the EU has always had a disproportionate leverage with China is through our ability to show what we've learned in the process of implementing our own domestic policies. And I think that's going to continue to be a case and continue to be an advantage that we have, for example, vis-a-vis the US, which does not have that track record of experience. So, in the context of assessing whether or not the Chinese 5-year plan is beginning to align with these more ambitious goals that they've set for themselves over the longer term, I think we're in a better position to kind of assess the level of ambition and integrity of their implementing policies. And I think that our Fit for 55 package, which will be published at the end of June, will provide even more benchmarks of how you have to go about doing getting emissions reductions under control. So yeah, I'm really sorry that I have to leave the conversation now, but hope that's been helpful, and look forward to following up. I'm sure the organizers can share my email as well if there are specific questions that you'd like to put to me. Pete, great to see you. Lara, great to meet you. And Bim, thanks to you and your colleagues for organizing this.
Thank you. And Jacob, you've got to be careful what you wish for around emails. Last question, because I think we've all got to finish at the hour, but I just wanted to get Sarah Miller's point in. And she has asked a question to Pete directly, but I suppose Lara also, please do comment and use this as an opportunity to round off. Could you elaborate a bit more on the differences between the role of COP president and the UK domestic agenda, and how the civil society movement in the UK is reflecting this in its work? And Pete, I'm remembering your point around how the UK thinks about these things and the difference between the domestic and the global. So if you could elaborate a little bit more about the difference between COP President and the UK domestic agenda, and Lara, if you could also do that, perhaps with the context of Spain last time as well.
Yes, delighted, Bim. Just very briefly, if I may, on to Barry on carbon markets, and I'll be very blunt. When I was EU lead negotiator, I knew that the EU didn't need this. We could do carbon markets anyway under the Paris Agreement. So the reason we wanted Article 6 was we knew we would pursue carbon markets with environmental integrity. We needed Article 6 to make sure the others had a minimum of environmental integrity. So it follows from that we wouldn't agree Article 6 at any price. So we wouldn't allow shed loads of hot air to come into the system as the price for agreeing Article 6. So, I mean, I agree with what Jake said. I mean, we agree it if we can do so in a rigorous way, but we also use the bottom-up rigorous systems to support that. I mean, in terms of the COP president's role, the COP president's role is to convene the global conversation. So, you know, clearly the EU, the US and others will all be lobbying everybody to raise their ambition, but it is the COP presidency's role to promote more ambition. It's a COP presidency's role to convene and encourage donors to meet the $100 billion target and to raise the proportion of adaptation spend. The COP presidency could take on a role convening international global recovery, convening conversations on debt, convening conversations on SDRs, for example, or reform of the international financial institutions. You have legitimacy and authority to take the world stage. It's also your job to be neutral and to find compromises on all these difficult issues like loss and damage. Loss and damage is a really difficult issue, and I'm glad that Jake answered it as carefully as he did. It is a big risk to the COP. I mean, just finally, I know we have to close. I mean, this question implies that all the NDCs are in. They're not all in. We don't have one from China. I can't stress enough how much China matters. The total quantum of NDCs we have so far, additional abatements, what, 3-4 gigatons? The gap to 1.5 degrees in 2030 is 29 gigatons. I mean, China could, you know, maybe we could double that if China did something ambitious. We'll still be short, and that is a central challenge for the COP, which I'm not sure is well understood, that the most benign outcome from the COP doesn't solve the problem. So we have to bank as much as we possibly can and then build on it for later. That's a big diplomatic challenge for the UK.
Lara, to finish off, over to you.
Thank you. Just to very briefly compliment, I think there's a very positive feedback loop in terms of the role of the COP president and domestic legislation. There's econometric analysis produced by the Grantham Research Institute, Alina Vertinkova and Professor Sam Pankhauser in their 2018 book on how hosting an international climate meeting, hosting a COP, has a statistically significant and positive impact in the adoption of framework climate laws. Now, the UK has a Climate Change Act since 2008, so you don't need that, but the push from the international is, I think, is significant. It certainly has helped us, and I hope it can help you as well. And I cannot stress enough how important your role can be in convening an international sustainable recovery alliance that can help us move forward, not only from COVID-19, but any other crisis and, you know, supply and demand shocks that may come in the future. So if we have this system in place, along with the, you know, financial ministers meeting that we had in Madrid for the first time, if I recall correctly, I think that would be something that would leave a very long-lasting mark in the international climate regime. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining. We've run over. Just want to say thank you for the panelists. Thank you all for joining, and there'll be more events soon. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Pete, nice to see you.
Nice to see you too.
Bye now.
Bye.